$210 million, 47 fake companies, one retired nurse who almost hit delete. That's the whole case in one breath. What follows is how a 38-second voicemail nobody was supposed to keep turned into the largest cross-border phone fraud takedown the FBI's Cincinnati field office had ever run. Dorothy Hensley was 71 years old, a retired ICU nurse from Chillicothe, Ohio, the kind of woman who'd spent 3 decades keeping other people calm during the worst moments of their lives. She'd worked nights for most of her career, the kind of shifts where you learn to read a monitor before a patient even knows something's wrong, where panic is a language you translate for other people instead of speaking yourself. She'd trained during an era when nurses were expected to defer to the doctors on the floor without question, and she'd spent years quietly building a reputation as someone who'd push back anyway when the numbers on a monitor didn't match what the chart said. That instinct, trust the data in front of you over the voice of authority, telling you not to worry about it, would matter more than anyone realized on March 11th. She retired in 2019, buried her husband 18 months later, and settled into the kind of quiet, disciplined life that widowhood sometimes forces on people who aren't naturally built for stillness. She gardened. She called her son Mark every Sunday. She kept her financial paperwork in an accordion folder labeled by year, a habit left over from decades of charting vitals in careful, legible handwriting. On March 11, 2024, at 2:14 in the afternoon, her phone rang while she was in the garden, kneeling in a bed of just-planted snap peas with dirt under her fingernails. She missed it. The voicemail that followed ran 38 seconds. A man identifying himself as Special Agent Daniel Reyes, of something called the Treasury Enforcement Division, told her there was a federal warrant out for her arrest. Case number IRS 8847C. Unpaid taxes. He said a squad car would be at her house within the hour, unless she resolved it immediately, by phone, using gift cards from Target and Walmart. His voice had the flat, over-rehearsed cadence of someone reciting a script for perhaps the 40th time that day, but wrapped in just enough procedural jargon, badge numbers, statute citations, references to Title 26 enforcement, to sound like something a retired nurse with no legal background would have no way to immediately disprove. She sat down on the porch step still holding her trowel and played it twice. Her hands were shaking by the second listen, not from fear exactly, she'd say later, but from that specific, disorienting feeling of being addressed by an institution as though you'd already done something wrong. She almost deleted it. Her thumb was over the trash icon. Then her son Mark called to check in, heard the tail end of it playing on speaker, and said the 4 words that mattered more than anything else in this story. Mom, don't delete that. Nobody at the FBI knew it yet, but that single decision, keep the recording instead of erasing it, was about to unravel a criminal network spanning 3 continents. Most robocall complaints go nowhere. The FTC's Consumer Sentinel database receives millions of them a year, and the overwhelming majority get logged, categorized, and forgotten, filed into a system so large that even a genuinely dangerous pattern can sit unread for months, buried under complaints that turn out to be duplicates, misdials, or dead ends. Dorothy didn't file a complaint through that system. She drove to the FBI's Columbus resident agency on April 2, 2024, walked up to the front desk with her phone in a plastic sandwich bag, like it was evidence from one of her old ICU shifts, and asked if anyone would actually listen to her voicemail. The duty agent at the desk that morning almost sent her home with a pamphlet on how to file online. Instead, on a hunch, he walked the request back to the Financial Crimes Unit himself. Special Agent Rachel Whitfield caught the file. She worked financial crimes out of the Cincinnati field office, and she'd heard hundreds of these calls before. She kept a running mental catalog of scripts, categorized almost the way Dorothy kept her tax folders: IRS warrant, grandchild in jail, tech support remote access, romance scam wire request. What she noticed wasn't the threat. Threats are boilerplate, cut-and-paste menace recycled across 1,000 identical scripts, the kind of thing you could transcribe from memory after a few months on this desk. What caught her attention was the background noise. Under the scripted panic, faint but audible, was the low hum of an open-plan office, keyboard clatter, a muffled voice 2 cubicles over, laughing at something unrelated to the call in progress. Somewhere further back, what sounded like a supervisor calling out a name. This wasn't a lone operator working from a basement. This was a call center, a workplace, with shifts and break room noise and, somewhere, a manager walking the floor. She isolated the audio, ran it through a basic spectral cleanup on her own workstation before it ever went anywhere official, just to confirm she wasn't imagining the pattern. She wasn't. Whatever this was, it had co-workers. Whitfield didn't know it yet, but that background hum would eventually lead investigators to 4 countries, 6,700 victims, and a floor of a Philippine office tower where people showed up to work robocall scripts the way other people show up to work retail shifts. Badge in, headset on, quota on a whiteboard by the door. Here's what's most surprising about this case. It isn't the size of the fraud. Networks this size aren't rare anymore. The Bureau opens cases against 9- and 10-figure fraud rings with grim regularity now. What's surprising is that it took one accidental piece of audio evidence, background noise the scammer never meant to include, 40 seconds nobody was supposed to still be holding on to expose the entire architecture underneath it. Everything else followed from that one detail. Whitfield sent the file to the FBI's Regional Computer Forensics Lab for audio analysis. The lab's process is unglamorous and slow, isolating individual frequency bands, running the ambient noise floor against a library of known call center acoustic signatures collected from prior cases, checking dialer software fingerprints embedded in call metadata that most people never realize gets recorded at all. What came back 3 weeks later reframed the entire case. The dialer signature embedded in the call's metadata, a kind of digital fingerprint left by the software used to place the call, matched 214 other complaints filed across 19 states over the previous 8 months. Same voice, same script structure, same background hum. The analyst who ran the comparison flagged it not as a possible match, but, in her own words on the report, as functionally identical, the kind of language forensic examiners use when they've stopped hedging. Her name was Priya Chandrasekaran, and she'd been doing acoustic forensics for the Bureau for 6 years, long enough to have built her own private, unofficial scale for how confident a match actually felt before the paperwork made it official. In a margin note she never expected anyone outside the lab to read, she wrote that this one was as certain as I've been on a case in years, the kind of line that, months later, would get quoted almost verbatim in a training briefing on why background noise should never be treated as an afterthought during transcription. On April 9, 2024, the Bureau opened a formal file. They called it Operation Dead Air. The first move was simple in concept and brutal in practice. Trace the spoofed number back to whoever was leasing it. Caller ID spoofing lets a scammer display any number they want. A local area code, a familiar business, sometimes even a real government line. But behind that display sits a real telecom infrastructure, leasing real number blocks from real wholesale providers. And that infrastructure has to be billed by somebody. Somewhere in the chain, actual money changes hands for actual server time, and money leaves a trail even when everything else about a scam is designed to leave none. Investigators subpoenaed the wholesale VoIP trunk provider, whose routing metadata showed up buried in the call records. The company was called Meridian Voice Exchange, and it turned out to be registered in Belize with no meaningful physical presence. A shell wrapped around a shell. The kind of entity that exists as a folder of incorporation paperwork and nothing else. For 6 weeks, subpoenas went unanswered, emails bounced, a registered agent in Belize City stopped responding entirely, and when an agent finally tracked down a phone number listed on the incorporation filing, it rang through to a voicemail box that had never been set up. I spent hours going through the case file on this one, and there's a single line in an agent status report that says it all. No further contact possible through standard channels. Escalating. 6 weeks of silence on an international financial subpoena is not unusual. It's just quietly maddening, and it's the kind of obstacle that never makes it into the highlight reel of a case like this. No dramatic standoff, just an inbox that stays empty week after week, while 6,700 people are still, at that point, actively being defrauded, and nobody investigating even knows the number yet. The break came sideways, the way most of them do. A junior analyst cross-referencing the trunk provider's public-facing billing portal, the login page customers use to pay their invoices, found a cached IP address in an old server log, leaked during an unrelated data breach 2 years earlier. It was the kind of find that depended entirely on someone doing tedious, unglamorous work, pulling archived breach dumps from public repositories, running string matches against known domain fragments, checking timestamps against the trunk provider's registration date. That IP geolocated not to Belize, and not to the shell company's nominal address, but to a commercial building in Cebu City, Philippines. At the same time, deeper analysis of the number leasing agreements revealed the actual operating entity behind the spoofed lines. A company called Adriatic Telecom Services, registered as a small business in Tirana, Albania. On paper, Adriatic looked like nothing, a modest regional telecom reseller with a handful of employees and an unremarkable filing history, the kind of business a bank compliance officer would glance at and clear in under a minute. In reality, it was leasing and operating 47 separate relay lines, dressed up to look like ordinary small business phone systems, scattered across dozens of U.S. area codes. Investigators started calling them the towers. 47 fake companies, each one a disguise for a line feeding straight back into the same operation. 3 continents, 1 case. And it was still April. Before the task force could move any further, they had to answer a much smaller, quieter question first. Who else had already reported this? And had anyone connected the dots before Whitfield did? A record specialist named Carla Ibanez was assigned to comb the FTC's Consumer Sentinel database and the FBI's own IC3 complaint system, cross-referencing script language and dollar amounts against the 214 matched complaints the RCFL had already flagged. It was slow, unglamorous work, reading complaint after complaint, most of them 2 or 3 sentences typed in frustration by a family member on behalf of a parent who was too embarrassed to file it themselves. Ibanez built a spreadsheet that would eventually become one of the case's most cited exhibits: victim age, dollar amount lost, state, script variant, date. By the time she finished her first pass in late April, the running total sat at just over $11 million in confirmed losses, spread across 406 identified victims. It was, everyone on the task force understood, almost certainly a fraction of the real number. Most victims of this kind of fraud never reported at all, out of embarrassment, out of fear their families will start questioning their competence, out of a simple unwillingness to relive the moment they realized they'd been had. Here's where the case stopped being a fraud investigation and became something closer to an international manhunt. If the money was moving through Albania and the call floor was running out of the Philippines, the FBI alone couldn't close this. They needed the Bureau's legal attaché office in Manila working directly with the Philippine National Bureau of Investigation's anti-cybercrime group, and simultaneously they needed the legal attaché covering Albania, coordinating with the Albanian state police. 2 foreign law enforcement partnerships, running in parallel, neither one able to move without tipping off the other side of the operation. Every phone call between Cincinnati and Manila had to be scheduled around a 13-hour time difference. Every update to the Albanian side had to route through a liaison who was, by necessity, juggling 4 other active cases at the same time. That's not a paperwork problem. That's a timing problem, and timing problems are what kill international cases before they ever reach a courtroom. Obstacle number 2 showed up almost immediately. NBI agents in Cebu identified a low-level call center employee who seemed increasingly uneasy about the work. A woman later identified as Katrina Salazar, 26 years old, recruited off a job listing that promised customer service, no experience necessary, and had turned out to be something else entirely. She'd taken the job 6 months earlier, after losing a call center position at a legitimate outsourcing firm during a round of layoffs, needing income fast to cover her mother's dialysis costs. The recruiter who hired her had described the role vaguely: collections work, U.S. clients. And by the time she understood what she was actually reading off the screen in front of her, she'd already been on the floor for 3 weeks, and had already, she would later tell her NBI handler, made calls to people who reminded her uncomfortably of her own grandmother. She began feeding details to her NBI handler: shift schedules, floor layout, the identity of the man everyone on the call floor referred to only as the colonel. She memorized badge numbers. She noted which exits were used for cash pickups on Fridays. She once sat through an entire lunch break recording, on a phone hidden in her lap, a floor supervisor bragging about a single call that had pulled $41,000 from a victim in Arizona. Weeks of quiet cooperation. Then, 48 hours before the coordinated raid was scheduled to move, she went dark. No calls, no messages. Her handler couldn't confirm whether she'd been discovered, had gotten cold feet, or was already in danger. Nobody on the task force said it out loud, but everyone was thinking the same thing. If she'd been made, the whole operation might already be compromised. The raid didn't happen that week. It happened 5 months later. What occurred in between is its own story, and we'll come back to Katrina Salazar, because what happened to her is not what anyone expected. Put yourself in Special Agent Whitfield's position for a second. You've got a confirmed international fraud network moving upward of $10 million a month. You've got a cooperating witness who has vanished. You've got 2 foreign law enforcement agencies you have to keep synchronized without either one leaking to the other's target. And you've got a growing stack of victim complaints landing on your desk every single week, each one a version of what almost happened to Dorothy Hensley, except most of them didn't stop in time. That's the job. Nobody warns you it looks like this. One of those complaints, filed in late May 2024, belonged to a man named Harold Denny, a retired machinist in Terre Haute, Indiana, 78 years old. His case didn't run through the IRS warrant script at all. It ran through a different variant entirely, one the task force would later catalog as the grandchild emergency script. He'd gotten a call at 6:40 in the morning from someone claiming to be his grandson, crying, saying he'd been in a car accident and needed $9,000 for bail before it went on his record and ruined his chance at a scholarship. A second voice came on the line moments later, identifying himself as a public defender, walking Harold through exactly how to wire the money. Harold had wired it before his wife was even awake. It wasn't until he called his daughter that afternoon to check on his grandson's court date that he learned the boy had been at football practice the entire morning, phone in his locker the whole time. Harold's complaint sat in Carla Ibanez's spreadsheet for weeks before the dialer signature match connected it to the same infrastructure running Dorothy's IRS script. Different script, same towers, same 47 relay lines, same laundering pipeline on the other end. It was, for the task force, one of the clearest pieces of proof that this wasn't one crew running one scam. It was a floor of people running a rotating menu of scripts against whatever demographic each script worked best on that week. Around the same time, a parallel piece of evidence processing work was quietly reshaping how prosecutors understood the money side of the case. A fraud analyst at Target's Corporate Loss Prevention Division, working off a preservation request the Bureau had sent in May, pulled internal redemption logs showing the exact minute each gift card in Dorothy's and Harold's cases had been activated for resale. Timestamps that, cross-referenced against the dialer records, showed cards being redeemed within 11 minutes of the victim reading the code aloud over the phone. A turnaround so fast it ruled out any possibility of a lone scammer manually reselling cards one at a time. It meant automation, a pipeline built specifically for speed, with someone or something on the other end simply waiting for numbers to type in. By mid-2024, the money trail had become almost as important as the call floor itself. Victims who fell for the scam were instructed to buy gift cards, Target, Walmart, Apple, sometimes all 3 in the same call, and read the redemption codes over the phone. Those codes moved fast. Within hours, they'd be resold through gift card marketplace platforms at a discount, laundering the value into ordinary-looking transactions, the kind of resale activity that, viewed in isolation, looks indistinguishable from a stranger simply reselling an unwanted gift card online. From there, the proceeds converted into cryptocurrency, funneled into a network of wallets controlled by a handler based in Chisinau, Moldova, a man named Dmitry Sova. Sova's job was to make $210 million disappear into noise. He had, according to financial records investigators later reconstructed, spent nearly a decade building relationships with a rotating cast of small, low-compliance cryptocurrency exchanges, the kind that ask few questions and process transactions quickly, precisely the qualities that made them useless for legitimate finance and perfect for laundering. Investigators eventually traced the crypto flow through 214 separate shell wallets, a deliberate layering strategy designed so that no single transaction looked large enough to flag, each wallet holding funds for only hours or days before splitting further, merging with unrelated transaction volume, and moving on. From there, the cleaned money moved into real estate purchases in Bucharest and into a shell logistics company in Costa Rica that existed, as far as anyone could tell, purely to justify large incoming wire transfers, invoices for shipping containers that were never loaded, freight manifests for cargo that never existed. That Costa Rica operation had its own handler, a man named Andres Villalobos, based in San Jose, who ran the domestic side of the U.S. Money Mule network, recruiting people, often unknowingly, to receive wired funds and forward them onward for a cut. Some of his recruits believed they were doing legitimate remote payment processing work advertised on job boards. A handful, investigators would later determine, understood exactly what they were doing and simply didn't care, as long as the 10% cut kept arriving. 4 people, 4 countries, 1 machine. Here's what this tells us about how this kind of fraud actually survives long enough to reach $210 million. It isn't one criminal mastermind running a genius scheme, it's specialization. The same principle that runs any legitimate business, just inverted. Basha owned the infrastructure. Dizon ran the floor. Sova moved the money. Villalobos handled the domestic mules. None of them needed to understand the whole operation. Each one only needed to be good at their one piece, and the fragmentation itself was the security system. Arrest one, and the other 3 keep running without missing a shift, because none of them had ever needed to know the other's real names in the first place, only their roles, their cut, and the schedule for the next transfer. And here's the layer nobody saw coming, the one that would end up defining how this case is remembered inside the bureau. The callers on that Cebu floor weren't masterminds either. They were employees, quota-driven, hourly, paid per successful extraction, working under a floor manager who tracked their numbers on a whiteboard, like any other sales operation. There were sales incentive structures, a bonus tier for agents who cleared $5,000 in a single week, a closer rotation, where the most persuasive voices on the floor were pulled in specifically for calls where a victim was wavering. There was even, according to Katrina Salazar's later testimony, a laminated sheet taped near the break room, listing the top 3 scripts by conversion rate that month, updated every Monday like a leaderboard. The terrifying authority in that voicemail, Dorothy Hensley almost deleted. The fake badge number, the fake warrant, the fake urgency. All of it was manufactured by someone reading from a script on a rented office floor, worried about hitting a quota before their shift ended. That contrast is the actual heart of this story. The fear on one end of the call was real. The person generating it was bored, or tired, or worried about their own bills, running the 9th call of a 10-hour shift. By August 2024, with the raid still months away, and the joint task force expanding, investigators began the slower work of building out victim testimony for the eventual prosecution, not just dollar figures, but depositions. One of those depositions, taken in a conference room at the Cincinnati field office, belonged to a woman named Evelyn Prater, 68, a retired schoolteacher from Dayton. She'd lost $14,000 to the tech support variant of the script, a pop-up on her computer warning of a virus, a phone number to call, a technician who convinced her to install remote access software and then walked her through purchasing gift cards to cover a security subscription that didn't exist. What made her deposition notable wasn't the amount. It was a detail she kept returning to, almost apologetically, as though she felt she should have known better. The technician had asked about her grandchildren by name, information he'd pulled from a data broker feed the operation subscribed to, as part of its target list infrastructure. It wasn't luck. It was a purchased list, cross-referenced against public social media profiles, sorted by estimated household net worth. Evelyn's testimony became one of the pieces of evidence that let prosecutors later argue the operation had engaged in a deliberate, systematic selection of victims based on vulnerability. Not opportunistic fraud, but targeted fraud, chosen and sorted like a marketing campaign. Obstacle number 3 arrived in October 2024, and it nearly cost the entire case. Investigators had finally located the back-end billing servers for Adriatic Telecom Services, the system recording every relay line, every call routed, every dollar of revenue the operation generated. That server was the single richest piece of evidence in the whole investigation, and it sat inside a data center in Tirana that Marco Basha, the network's Albanian owner, controlled directly. 20 minutes before Albanian state police were set to execute a preservation warrant on that server, an analyst monitoring the network's traffic noticed something wrong: a spike in outbound data usage consistent with a bulk file transfer, followed by signs that someone was preparing to wipe the drive array remotely. The analyst, working the overnight shift out of Cincinnati specifically to stay aligned with Tirana's daytime hours, flagged it immediately through an encrypted channel to the Albanian liaison, who then had to physically reach the strike team already staged 2 blocks from the data center. Someone inside the operation had been tipped off, possibly the same breach that had spooked Katrina Salazar 5 months earlier, possibly something else entirely, a compliance officer at the data center itself, curious about the unusual warrant request, a leak somewhere inside the chain of officials who'd signed off on the preservation order. Nobody was ever able to fully close that loop. Albanian police moved the warrant execution up by hours, without full legal review, racing a countdown nobody could confirm the length of. Officers arrived to find 2 technicians already in the server room, one of them mid-keystroke on a terminal that, forensic analysts would later confirm, had a wipe script loaded and staged to execute. They got there in time. Barely. The server was still intact, though forensic analysts later found deletion scripts queued and ready to fire, timed to trigger in under 4 minutes, had the raid arrived even slightly later. We'll say the part that'll probably draw some pushback. The near miss with that server should never have been that close. A case with this many moving international pieces needed faster interagency legal authorization than what Albanian police had that week. And the fact that a 20-minute margin was the difference between recovering the evidence and losing it says more about bureaucratic friction than about anyone's individual competence. Would you have made the same call, moving without full legal sign-off, betting that speed mattered more than process? That's the actual dilemma Albanian investigators faced with a countdown clock nobody could verify. In the weeks after the server seizure, forensic teams in Tirana worked around the clock, cataloging what they'd recovered. Call logs stretching back to 2019, internal spreadsheets tracking revenue by relay line, and the detail that would end up anchoring much of the eventual indictment, an internal messaging archive where Marco Basha and his lieutenants had discussed the business in language stripped almost entirely of euphemism. One message, dated early 2023 and later entered into evidence, read simply, "Cebu floor underperforming this month. Tell Dizon to rotate in the IRS script. Always converts better in Q1." It was the kind of line that, read aloud in a courtroom, does more to establish criminal intent than 100 pages of financial reconstruction ever could. By December 2024, Operation Dead Air had assembled enough evidence to move. Wiretaps authorized months earlier had captured Marco Basha discussing monthly revenue targets in language that could have come from any regional telecom executive, except the product being sold was fear. Financial records tied every major shell wallet back to Dmitry Sova, undercover purchases of gift cards, traced in real time by agents posing as newly recruited resellers on the marketplace platforms Sova's network used, confirmed the exact laundering pathway analysts had mapped from Dorothy Hensley's original complaint all the way to Moldova. In one instance, an undercover agent successfully bought a batch of gift card codes directly from an account, later confirmed to be operated by one of Sova's associates. Codes that, when cross-referenced, matched redemption numbers Evelyn Prater had read aloud over the phone 4 months earlier. The chain, for the first time, was unbroken end-to-end. Victim, script, floor, launderer, wallet. Here's the detail that stuck with me reading through the case file. The arithmetic of the fraud itself. $210 million, moved since the operation began sometime in 2019. 6,700 identified victims across the United States and Canada, the overwhelming majority of them elderly. Average individual loss, according to the Bureau's tally, just under $31,000. That's not abstraction. That's someone's retirement account, someone's medical fund, someone's house payment, taken $31,000 at a time by people treating it as a sales metric, tracked on a whiteboard, ranked on a leaderboard updated every Monday morning. In the final weeks before the raid, the task force ran what they internally called a dry run briefing, a full walkthrough, conducted over a secure video link linking Cincinnati, Manila, Tirana, Chisinau, and San Jose simultaneously, where each country's lead agents laid out their entry plan, their evidence custody procedures, and their contingency if any single target got tipped off before the others. It was, by every account from people who sat in on it, one of the most complex coordination sessions any of the participating agencies had run. A translator sat in on the Albanian and Moldovan channels simultaneously, relaying real-time updates so that no single agency was ever more than a few minutes behind the other's understanding of the plan. Whitfield, watching from Cincinnati, later described the moment the 4 country leads confirmed their go times as the first point in 8 months of work where the case felt, in her words, like it might actually close instead of just grow. Coordinating a raid across 4 countries simultaneously is not like coordinating one across 4 American states. Time zones alone create an 11-hour spread between Cebu and San Jose. Warrants had to be authorized under 4 separate legal systems, each with its own standard of evidence, its own judicial timeline, its own capacity for a leak. The date they landed on was January 14, 2025. At 4 a.m. local time in Cebu City, agents from the Philippine National Bureau of Investigation moved on the 14th floor of a commercial office tower in the IT Park Business District, a building that, from the outside, looked like any other business process outsourcing office in a city full of them, its lobby directory listing the floor simply as Meridian Client Services. Agents staged in unmarked vehicles 2 blocks away for nearly 40 minutes prior, running a final radio check with the Tirana and Chisinau teams before moving, weapons holstered but body armor on underneath plain jackets, so the building's night security wouldn't clock them as anything other than late-arriving tenants. Inside, 62 call agents were working active shifts when the doors came down, headsets still on, mid-call in several cases. Investigators later noted that at least 3 calls were still connected and being recorded automatically by the floor's own dialer software at the moment agents entered, meaning the raid itself was captured, incidentally, from inside an active scam call. Ramon Dizon, the floor manager everyone had known only as the Colonel, was arrested at his desk, a half-finished cup of coffee still warm beside his keyboard. Investigators seized 140 workstations, banks of headsets, and physical binders of scam scripts organized by victim type: IRS warrant, grandparent emergency, tech support, romance. Simultaneously, 4,000 miles away, Albanian state police moved on a villa outside Tirana. Marco Basha was arrested before he'd finished his morning coffee, still in a bathrobe when officers came through the front gate, his laptop open on the kitchen table displaying, according to the arrest report, a live dashboard tracking that week's revenue across all 47 relay lines. Investigators froze $9.4 million in an offshore account tied directly to Adriatic Telecom Services, along with title documents for 2 properties in Bucharest that had been purchased through the laundering pipeline 18 months earlier. In Chisinau, Moldovan authorities, working off intelligence shared through the Joint Task Force, took Dmitry Sova into custody and seized crypto wallets holding an estimated $22 million in Bitcoin and Monero. Sova reportedly attempted, in the roughly 90 seconds between hearing officers at his door and the door actually opening, to reach for a laptop containing wallet access keys. Officers reached the device before he could execute a remote wipe command that forensic analysts later found had been drafted and saved as a one-click script, evidently prepared for exactly this contingency. And in San Jose, Costa Rican judicial police arrested Andres Villalobos, seizing $3.1 million in cash and a stack of property titles connected to the laundering operation's real estate purchases, along with a ledger, handwritten, oddly, in a case built almost entirely on digital infrastructure, tracking commissions owed to each of his domestic mule recruits by name. 47 relay lines went dark within 6 hours of the first warrant execution. The towers fell, one by one, faster than anyone still inside the operation could react. By the time news of the Cebu raid reached whatever remained of the operation's outer network, smaller recruiters, minor mules, peripheral players who'd never been read in on the full structure, there was nothing left to salvage. Bank accounts were frozen, servers were seized, the whiteboard with that week's call numbers on it sat, still chalked in an evidence photo that would later be entered into the record. In the first 48 hours after the raid, NBI investigators ran Ramon Dizon through an initial interview at a processing facility outside Cebu, before he'd even secured counsel, using the leverage of the seized dialer logs to walk him through calls he clearly recognized his own voice on. He was combative at first, insisting he was just management, a phrase the interviewing agent noted he repeated 4 times in the space of 20 minutes, as though distance from the actual calls might translate into distance from the actual charges. It didn't. By the second interview session, with a public defender present, Dizon had stopped denying his role and started, cautiously, asking what cooperation might be worth. Here's what happened to Katrina Salazar, the informant who vanished 5 months earlier and left the entire task force wondering whether the case had been blown. She hadn't been discovered. She'd panicked after overhearing Ramon Dizon mention, almost in passing, that someone from outside had been asking questions about the call floor's staffing records. Certain she was about to be exposed, she fled to a relative's home in a neighboring province and cut off contact entirely rather than risk a phone that might be monitored, leaving behind the burner device her handler had given her, wrapped in a plastic bag and buried in a potted plant on her apartment balcony, in case anyone came looking for it. For 5 months she worked odd shifts at a market stall, telling no one, including her mother, where she'd actually gone or why. NBI agents eventually re-established contact through an intermediary in November 2024. A former coworker Katrina trusted, approached carefully, and vetted over several weeks before the connection was made. She resumed cooperating, this time from a secure location, and her testimony about the floor's operating structure became a central piece of the case against Dazan, including detail about the leaderboard system, the recruitment pipeline, and the specific moment Dazan had learned outside questions were being asked. She never lost her nerve. She lost her phone signal and her trust that any channel was safe. Given what almost happened to her, that's a hard instinct to argue with. The case rested on evidence nobody could have predicted at the outset. A background hum in a scam voicemail, a cached IP address in a 2-year-old data breach, wiretap audio spanning 14 months, and a cooperating witness who went dark and came back. Prosecutors built the indictment around wire fraud conspiracy, money laundering conspiracy, and aggravated identity theft, charges that, combined, carry decades of potential exposure for each defendant. The formal indictment ran to 112 pages, cataloging script variants, wallet addresses, and victim counts by state, an exhibit list heavy enough that prosecutors reportedly needed 2 banker's boxes just to move the physical copies between offices. Ramon Dazan pleaded guilty in September 2025 and was sentenced to 11 years in federal custody, with credit negotiated in exchange for detailed testimony about the call floor's internal structure, testimony that named individuals above him in the hierarchy the Bureau had not yet fully mapped, including a previously unidentified recruiter believed to be responsible for staffing at least 2 other call floors elsewhere in Cebu. A lead investigators are still actively pursuing as of this recording. Marco Basha is fighting extradition from Albania as of this recording. Albanian courts have jurisdiction questions to resolve before he can be transferred to face charges in the United States, and his legal team has signaled they intend to contest every available procedural avenue, arguing among other things that the preservation warrant executed on the Tirana server in October 2024 was itself procedurally defective, given the compressed timeline under which it was authorized. The same 20-minute margin that saved the evidence is now, unsurprisingly, at the center of his defense. Dmitry Sova's case is tangled in Moldova's own extradition framework, which lacks a direct treaty pathway for several of the specific charges involved. A legal gap prosecutors are still working to close, reportedly through a narrower set of charges that would fall under an existing mutual legal assistance agreement between the 2 countries. Andres Villalobos was extradited from Costa Rica in the spring of 2025 and has entered a plea agreement, cooperating in exchange for a reduced sentence recommendation, and has since provided investigators with additional detail on at least 9 previously unidentified domestic money mules operating in 3 U.S. states. Of the $210 million believed to have moved through this network since 2019, investigators have recovered a fraction: the frozen accounts, the seized crypto, the Costa Rican properties, totaling somewhere in the neighborhood of $38 million in identifiable assets. Restitution, for 6,700 victims, will almost certainly never make most of them whole. A federal restitution fund has been established, and victims like Harold Denny and Evelyn Prater have both filed claims, but attorneys working the case have been candid with victims that any eventual payout is likely to represent only a small percentage of what each person actually lost. Here's the part nobody likes to sit with. Most of that $210 million is simply gone. Laundered through enough layers, converted through enough currencies, funneled into enough shell purchases and offshore accounts, that recovering it isn't a matter of more investigation, it's a mathematical impossibility at this point. The people who lost $31,000 on average are not getting $31,000 back. Dorothy Hensley never lost a cent. She didn't fall for the scam, she just happened to save the one piece of evidence that mattered. In the spring of 2025, the FBI's Cincinnati field office invited her to a small ceremony recognizing her role in the case, held in a conference room with a sheet cake and a handful of agents who'd worked the file for the better part of a year, several of whom she was meeting in person for the first time, despite having spoken with them by phone a dozen times over the previous 12 months. She told local reporters afterward that she almost didn't go because she still felt like all she'd done was refuse to hit delete. Mark, her son, stood at the back of the room during the ceremony, And when a reporter asked him afterward how it felt to know a single sentence he'd said on a Sunday phone call had helped unravel a $210 million network, he reportedly just shrugged and said he was glad he'd called when he did. He almost hadn't, that particular Monday, because he'd been running late for work. That's the whole case, really. Not a hero with a badge cracking a code. A woman in a garden who let her son talk her out of throwing something away. Would this network have kept running for years if that one voicemail had been deleted like almost every other one? Almost certainly. There's no reason to think this case was inevitable. It was one decision, at one kitchen table, that could have gone the other way. If you've gotten one of these calls, the fake warrant, the fake agent, the fake urgency demanding gift cards over the phone, you already know how convincing it sounds in the moment. We cut a few details from this story for length, including exactly how investigators cross-referenced that leaked server log to the Cebu building, and the full account of the wiretap that first caught Marco Basha discussing revenue targets by name. Comment more if you want the full technical breakdown in a follow-up video. $210 million. 4 men under arrest, 1 still fighting extradition, 6,700 victims, and 1 saved voicemail that started all of it. If you want to see how the FBI unraveled the next network like this one, subscribe, and we'll see you in the next case.